that details a little bit about the interface, some commands that are useful that I'm going to go over for creating curves. And then we'll get into this, which is sort of an alternate part of the process if you were to use Photoshop. How I set up this file, right? We're going to start anew, or I guess we'll give a quick overview of where we're going to end up. So there's a couple of steps here that we're going to go through. One is going to be creating curves in order to generate this 3D geometry based on an AI image. And then when we explore the Photoshop section, we'll show how we get this result, which is an alternate version. You don't need to do this, just a kind of added bonus that I'm going to explain if you were to use Photoshop as part of the process. And then setting up a little simple scene in order to get this rendered out. And this is what the render view looks like ultimately out of Blender. Not sure why it's not showing correctly. I did move this file back and forth a few times or change some settings, but this is what that result was as far as like an animation. So this is that modified 3D logo with just a little bit of effect. So we're going to open up a new window here in Blender so we can start explaining the fundamentals. So when you set up a new file for Blender, it looks like this. And typically what we do is we select everything by clicking and dragging in the 3D viewport. We can create a selection box here. If we do from right to left, it selects everything that it comes into contact. And if we do from the left to right, usually that's a different case, but not here because of the selection tool we're using. So this is where all your tools are gonna show up, is on the left-hand toolbar. And the shortcut for the selection tool is W. So if you hit W, you continue to switch through the different selection types. And clicking and holding here shows you all of them as well. So we have a select lasso, which would be like more freeform if we needed to. And we have a selection circle, which is sort of like a brush, like anything we just kind of move over, we select. This is your 3D viewport, quite obviously. If you use our middle mouse wheel, we're zooming in and out. And I can orbit around if I click down on the middle mouse wheel. If I hold shift before I click on the middle mouse, I start panning around. And then with control, we have a more precise zoom. So that's a little bit of just how to get around the 3D viewport and selecting different objects. I'm going to go back to my selection box. Just clicking on an object will also select it. If you click on an object and you hold shift, and you can continue to add objects to your selection, but the object that shows up in bright orange versus dark orange is your active selection. So even though we have a bunch of things selected, out of that whole group, there's one thing that's sort of our main selected object. Over here, we can see we have this sort of like view gumball that we can move around by clicking and dragging. And then we can also snap to any view by just clicking on one of these. So if I want to go to the top view, I would just click on Z positive, because Z negative would take me underneath, right? So if I just click on Z here, I can flip from top to bottom. So Z positive, so we're on top. Select everything and delete. So also in part of the Notion, you'll see some plugins that we need to enable. So in order to do that, we go to our top toolbar, which is up here. In our top toolbar, we have File, Edit, Render, Window, and then all these different workspaces. We're going to stay in Layout, but if we do wanted to focus on modeling, you could click on Modeling, and the interface is a little bit different. If you wanted to do sculpting, that's a little bit different. UV editing, texture paint, etc. So we're going to go to Edit, Preferences, and in here, there's some add-ons we want to enable. So add-ons are just kind of like plugins, and a lot of them come pre-installed within Blender, but you have to activate them. So we can go over here to Add Curve, and we can enable those. So we want Add Curve, Curve Tools, and we want Add Curve, Extra Objects. We also want to search for Image, So if we search for image, we want to enable import export images as planes. And with that enabled, we can now add in an image as a plane. There's two ways that we could do that. We could go to File, Import, Images as Planes. This selection now shows up in File, Import if we've enabled the add-on. And we can add anything into the 3D viewport, which will snap onto this icon here in the center, called our 3D cursor. So if we hit Shift A, we can add anything. And we've got here under image, images as planes after enabling the add-on as well. So once I click on that, I can look for my image. Any questions so far on that, or should I recap anything I just went over?
Yeah, so I got a little lost on the enabling what I need to enable for the image to come in.
Yeah.
So what is it under edit?
Yeah. Edit,
And then
preferences,
preferences. Okay.
and under add-ons.
Okay. Add-ons is the add curve.
Yeah. So we wanted add curve, curve tools,
Okay, got
add
it.
curve abstract objects.
Uh-huh.
And then you want to search after you enable those, you want to search for image. And then that's going to filter out import images as planes.
Got it.
So with that
Okay.
set, we can do Shift A. Was there another part?
No, got it.
Cool. We can do images as planes. Look for our images. So here's my logo that I want to use. I'm going to select that. I'm going to hit import images as planes. You zoom in, and at first, it doesn't look like anything. And that's because we're in solid view. So solid view is where you see your 3D geometry grayed out like this. In order to see the image applied onto this plane, we hold Z and then we hover our mouse over material preview. And that's just quickly letting us see the material that we've applied on that surface. So importing images as planes is creating a plane with that image applied on as a texture. You could also click or just tap Z so that you can have this menu up and select any view. This tends to work better when using a touchpad on a laptop, I've noticed, but I typically hold Z when I have a mouse. And we want to go to the top view. So I'm going to click on Z over here so I can snap to the top. Now, on the right-hand side, we've got our outliner. So our outliner is where we see all our layers. And our layers are structured by what the geometry is. So here we have an object. And if I expand this, we could see multiple properties of that object. So this is the vector properties of the object, meaning its points and edges. And then, sorry, no, that's its UV map. UV map is, won't get into it now, but it's basically how this image is applied onto this surface. Because we could distort how the image is showing up on the surface if we wanted to look at it differently. But since it's matching perfectly, this UV map is basically designating this material, which is the image, perfectly onto that square. You don't have to worry about that too much, just explaining how that works. But here we know that this is an object because of the little orange triangle here, and we have it in our collection called collection. So collection is kind of groups of things, which we'll get into more later. So with this, what we want to do is we add a new object. So we hit Shift A, and we're going to add in a Bezier curve. So we go to curve, and we click on Bezier. Bezier. I've realized lately that I've been saying it wrong. It's not Bezier. It's something more French, Bezier or something like that. I got to listen to it again. But with that, we now have in our outliner under this main collection a Bezier curve added in. So we see it has the curve icon and it has the curve mapping underneath. Any questions on that?
Okay, I got the curve in, but my image is still showing up as a like gray square.
So if you tap on Z on your keyboard and you hover over to
Okay.
material preview, you should be
Yes.
able to see that image show up.
Material. Okay, got it.
Cool. So you'll notice my curve is white. I did that on purpose just so it shows up better on camera, but if you see yours fine, then that's okay. Where you change the color for things, if we go back to edit preferences, under themes, we can basically change the appearance of anything. So under 3D viewport, I just changed my wires to white. You don't need to do this, but just letting you know if something's different on mine than yours, that's because under edit preferences, themes, we can change basically the whole interface to look like how we want it. So with this curve, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to introduce edit mode. And what edit mode is basically being able to modify this object and see all those points and its constituent elements. If I select this plane, we see it outlines the plane in orange, and we're in object mode right now. We know that because it says that on the top left for object mode. So I could select edit mode here, but the quicker way is to hit tab on your keyboard. And now what I am able to see is we just had highlighted the whole face. We have these white edges, and then we have these black dots on the corners. So these are vertexes, which are points that make up a mesh geometry, which most things in Blender will be a mesh. We have our edges. So up here, we have our selection mode. So we can flip from selection mode of vertices and switch over to the selection mode of edges. So now I could click on the different edges and select them in orange. Or I could go to face and I could select the entire face. We're not going to be messing too much with meshes right now, but we are going to select our curve and tab into it and then view it from top view. So to move things around in Blender, we hit G. So I could, since we went into edit mode, everything is selected at the moment because all of these points that make up this curve are orange. So if I hit G to move, I'm moving the whole thing. I'm going to move it over to the left. But that would actually be a bit of a mistake to move it within edit mode. The reason is everything in Blender has an origin, meaning a reference point or an anchor point, essentially. And by default, it's going to be either where the 3D cursor is, so the very center of the model, or the very center of the object itself. If I'm in edit mode, I'm moving these points within that same object, so that anchor point stays in the same place. If I tab out of edit mode and into object mode, and I move this curve, we see that point, then the very center, that anchor point I'm talking about, move with it. So I want to move it just on the red axis, which I can do by hitting X. So after hitting G to move, I just hit X and I'm snapped onto the red axis. And I can move it over here. To backtrack, we'll go over that again. If I'm in edit mode and I hit G to move and then X for the X axis, I don't have that center point carrying through. And if I tab out into object mode, I now see my origin or my anchor point. It's called an origin point. I see my origin point is still way out here, relevant to where it was earlier. So I'm just going to move it over to the side, go back into top view, and then tab in so that I can see my curve. Any questions?
How do you move the curve?
With
I
G.
can't move anything on it. I keep clicking G and trying to move, but it's not letting me move.
So you need to have it selected. So make sure that you're clicking on it and it's turning orange and that
Yes,
you're in object mode.
object mode. Okay. And then G and then move it. Oh my gosh, wait, I did it. Hold on. I got
G
it.
and X. Yeah.
Okay,
To
got
just
it.
move it aside. So what was happening was you're probably in edit mode. So you can hit tab to get into edit mode again, but you didn't
Uh-huh.
have anything selected. You just see looking at this. So if I hit G right now, nothing's going to happen because I'm inside edit mode
Yeah.
and I don't have any points selected. So we could select this one point, we could select this other point, or we could select both. If I select both and hit G, it moves around. If I select only one end, it's just moving that one end, and it's moving this other one. These red lines that are coming out are called handles. So if I move just this point, it's modifying how that curve carries through the other vertex. And if I make it shorter, it sort of has less of an influence. If I make this one on this side longer, it has a bigger influence. So that's how we see that these handles are informing that shape of the curve. We're going to select everything by hitting A and then delete or X. And then we want to hit this dissolve vertices. So right now we have a curve object with absolutely nothing in it. So while still in edit mode, what we're going to do, and the reason I did that, is because there's a much better way of doing curves now in Blender, which is using the pen tool or the curve pen, which is right here. And this works very much like it does in Photoshop and Illustrator. If I click here, I made a point. If I click over here, I make another point, and the handles are straight on. If I now click over here, but I click and drag, I'm creating handles. So I can basically trace over an object by doing this. If I wanted to change one of these handle types, I can select one of those points by going back to my selection tool with W and clicking on one of these points, and I can move these handles around. And there's a neat thing here too. If you want to change the type of connection that this is, you would hit V. And then we have automatic, vector, aligned, or free. So automatic will kind of make it so that if I move this, we see that those handles are changing on their own to adapt to keeping itself smooth. If I hit V again, and I do vector, it's a straight edge. So I can move each side independently and it makes a harsh little kink. That's what we call them when it kind of does this little thing. It's a kink. So V again, we could do aligned. So with aligned, it would only move aligning itself to the curve here. It's basically trying to keep this aligned and considering the vector that's happening over here. So that handle would actually change if I move this one over here. Okay, so I'm going to delete this and we're going to go over this again, but we're going to do it on top of our image. So we trace this logo out. Any questions before we get started on that?
Nope, got it.
So hit Shift A, Bezier, tab into it, hit A, and then delete, dissolve vertices. And now we're inside a new curve object with no curves in it. So we can trace our portion of the logo. So I'll go over to the curve pen and I want to start with a curve. So I'll just start clicking and dragging here, creating some handles and continuing along this logo to basically trace it. Another thing to consider is if you have a symmetrical logo like I do, it's worth only doing half of it and then mirroring it. But in this case, I'm just going to keep it to what I'm doing at the moment. So I'm actually going to treat this as a 3D object. So in here in 2D, this is getting cut off. But rather than cutting it off, in my case, I'm going to pretend. We're not going to pretend. I'm going to actually, what we were talking about before, rationalizing, right? So actually making this into a 3D infinity sign. So now I've come to a point where I need to connect these two together. So I go to my selection box, I select these 2 points, and then when I right click, this is what we call a context menu. So all these items show up here when you have something selected or when you're working on anything that you're editing. Like this menu up here is going to change to show you the different things that you can do to the things that you're working with or the things that you're editing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use make segment. So I could do that by going to control points, make segment, right clicking and hitting make segment, or the shortcut right here is F. And what that'll do is it'll just connect these 2 points and close out my curve. I can now move this around and kind of refit my points and my handles so that it fits nicely to the shape. Okay. So in my instance, I need another curve. So I'm going to hit the pen curve again. I'm going to start on my new curve right down here. And continue to do my handles. Any questions as I'm going through this for this part of the process?
I'm working on it. I'm on my first line. I'm a little behind you.
No worries. You don't have to follow along exactly. The recording is going to be available after.
I'm doing the pen. Because mine doesn't have really any curves in it.
So in that case, if it's just straight edges, you can, instead of clicking and dragging, you could
Yeah.
just click. And by just clicking, it'll make like sharp corners. If you're working with like with which you are working with straight geometry.
Okay, wait. If I put lines and now I don't want them anymore because I messed up, how do I get rid of them? If they're on top of my image.
So you want to get rid of something that's already created like along the way.
Yeah, of like a line that I drew that I don't want anymore.
So you could select that vertex and then do Control X and it'll dissolve it. Basically, dissolving means it kind of deletes it, but it'll reconnect those 2 points on either side. So you click that point you don't want and you Control X and the curve should refit without that point. Let me know when you've got a viable shape. Don't worry about getting something perfectly or exactly or doing too many things. If you just get one shape done, that's all we need at the moment.
I mean, I got like 3 lines down. Um, I don't see them in my um layers though.
You
Because
don't see
I get
your Bezier curve?
no,
Or do you only see one?
no, I just see my image.
Oh, did you go into edit mode within your image?
Yeah.
Gotcha. What we wanted to do was create a curve to then do that as a separate object from the image. But that's okay. If what you have right now, if I hide my curve and I do what you did, which is if I tabbed into the image and then I started doing a curve within here, where did you find the pen tool here?
On the left.
Did you select the annotate tool?
Yeah, that's probably where I made the mistake.
Yeah, that's no, it's not it. Yeah. So you want to
Okay.
tab out of the plane,
Okay.
hit Shift A to add in a curve, and then you're gonna select Bezier, the first one. And then you tab into that to do edit mode on that one. And you should
Okay.
have this one here, the curve pen tool.
Yes, okay. Okay, so I have my curve, and then where is the curve pen?
It's
Okay,
this one
gotcha.
here.
Okay.
Okay. So you're drawing out the curve object now?
Yeah.
Cool. Once we have that curve object, um, did you follow then on how to merge, like how to close your curve using F?
No.
So if you're doing like a shape and you come down to your
Uh-huh.
last 2 points, like for example, if I were to do this outline real quick, if I do the pen tool, I'm just gonna do this very roughly. And once I come down to my last 2 points over here, I'm going to go to my selection tool, select my 2 last points right here that I want to connect and hit F. And then that'll create a path in between
Okay.
them. And you have a closed shape. All right. Anything else we need to address before we move into messing with this image on that curve?
No, they're good.
Cool. So if we select this object here, it's a curve. I've just kind of moved it up here with GZ on the Z axis. Where we're going to go is over on the right-hand side. This is where our properties are. We haven't talked about this yet, but this is basically how we edit properties for pretty much anything. So depending on what I select, if I select this curve in object mode, I get some curve properties and I get material properties and a bunch of other stuff. If I select a plane, I get some of the same properties, but it changes a little bit because it is a mesh. So there's a curve and a mesh, and then lights and cameras will all have their different properties. So we, for the curve selected, we go to object data properties, and we can set it as either a 3D curve or a 2D curve. Right now, it's just a flat curve, which is 2D. So I'm going to switch over to 2D mode. And then for fill, I can put front, back, or both. I'm going to hit both. And so we see that fills in the regions of the curve. It did leave the middle open. So with that, it's tabbing into it, and I'd have to pass some of these points underneath. So I'll select these and just hit GZ in edit mode. Ooh, something's going wrong. And it might not be allowing me because I set it to 2D. So if I switch it over to 3D and I move it down, I can have that pass underneath. And then in 3D fill mode, I can set it to front or back, but I don't see it working out with this one. Twist method. Just fine. I think with 3D tools, I think for now I'm just going to keep it to 2D for my intents and purposes. Because I can edit this a bit later to do what I want it to do. So for now, I'll just keep it to the 2D, and the transition to having it pass behind it is going to have to come in just a little bit. So there's different things that we could do. Ignoring that cut there, we can do an offset. So the curves can offset off of itself, and you'll see that fill or region change, or you might see it get larger or smaller for you, depending on your shape. We can do extrude, so that pushes in vertical direction. And if we have fill enabled up here for both, it'll have that face built in on both sides of the extrusion. If I only have it on one, so if I put it onto back, it'll only be on the bottom. And if I set it to only front, it'll be only on the top. So we set it to both, and it's basically a capped object. We could do more, such as going down here to the bevel section and increasing the bevel depth here is going to round out those edges. Depending on how your curve flows, you're going to have that bevel do different things. So right here, we could see it's actually beveling inward. And that's more so just how I built the curves here. So if I go back to edit mode and I see my curves again, I can also move the curve in edit mode and it'll still retain or switch out those properties. So what's happening with that bevel is my handles are actually cutting inside of the object. So because of the way that the handles are set up around here, it must be setting it up. So for example, this handle, I'd want to be towards the outside so that I have no handles cutting into the object, which would be causing that fold to happen that way. You could also select all of these points and hit V and then set it to automatic, and it'll modify all of them so that they're kind of flowing together. It kind of smoothens it out. So I could spend a bit more time troubleshooting why that's happening, but I want to move on to the next section, which would be making this 3D. So I want to undo some of the stuff I've done here. So I'm going to undo the extrude. And I'm going to undo my bevel. So I just have this flat thing, right? And if I hit right click, or I'm going to duplicate it first. So I have two. So I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate, escape, so that it snaps to its original place. And I'm going to hide that new one and work on this one here. So I just have several duplicates, so I can always backtrack to a previous version of it. Before I move into making this into a mesh, you have any questions or anything I should go over again?
No, I'm kind of just watching you now.
Okay. That's probably for the best.
Yeah.
I'll follow through on the process
I'll
a little
mess
bit.
around with it more, but yeah, I'm
Yeah,
just watching.
for sure. So if I tab into it, or before I tab into it, I right click to bring up the context menu and I can do to convert to mesh. So now if I tab, this is now mesh geometry, and we'll see it kind of created all these triangular faces, which isn't very cool, but that's okay. If I undo a couple times, so it's back to being a curve. Before I set it into a mesh, I'm going to set it as a 3D curve. Select these points, move them down underneath. I missed one there. Set that to automatic. There we go. So it's kind of folding under. Now I can hit right click, convert to mesh. And now if I tab into it and hit A, I'm selecting all the curves, but now they are mesh edges. And if I right click a context menu for a mesh, I'll have here fill. Where is it? Face, inset faces, wireframe, fill. There we go. Alt F. So again, just because of how the geometry is working out for me, the fact that it's like this infinity sign, it's getting to be a little bit tedious to get this to work down in the middle. So I wanted to show curves because most of the time when you're doing 2D objects, this is how you want to trace them, which is a pretty cool effect to have here in the center. I'm actually kind of not too mad about that, or I would want to keep exploring how that can work. It sort of creates this this icon as well, like sort of like a half icon, which is sort of a happy accident. But if I went about this another way could be to hide this with H, Shift A, mesh, plane, And rather than working off of a curve, I can start working off of a plane. So I'll hit S to scale this down, GZ to move it up, and continue to use S, G, and R to rotate, move, and scale. Now, if I have it fit this portion here, I can go now into edit mode with tab, select edge mode, select that edge, and hit E. And now I'm sort of building this out by creating new faces. And it's not smooth. You might have to like keep resizing or keep rotating and switching it up. But what I want to do early on is add what's called a modifier. So just like we had extrude and bevel for that curve, we can add certain things here under the wrench. And this is the modifier tab for these meshes. And if I do subdivision, it'll round it out. And if I go into edit mode, I now see my rectilinear wireframe, but I also see it taking on this rounder shape. And now for to build this out, oops, extrude is with E. And you definitely want to be doing this in top view. So I just messed up, right? I was doing this in a perspective and it flattened out. And I want to go back to top view to continue working. But if I do that, I'm working in a distorted 3D view. So the way to fix that is you go into side view, you select everything, and then you hit S to scale. But if you hit S and then you hit Z, you're only scaling on the Z axis, stretching it on the Z axis. And if you hit 0, it's going to scale it completely flat. So I see there it still has some lift, so I can switch to vertex mode. And same thing, if I hit S in vertex mode, I'm scaling all those points together. If I hit SZ, I'm scaling those points only on the Z axis. And if I hit 0, they all get just flattened out. And now I can keep going in my top view, knowing that this is flat. I'm not going to take this method all the way. I just wanted to show a little bit how another way of tracing these objects can work out. To wrap up on what we can do here in Blender, I'm going to hit Alt-H to unhide everything. And then I'll start hiding the things that I don't want. So this is the one that I do want, which is now a mesh. I'm going to go to top view. I'm going to go to the material properties, which is down here for the object. And I'm going to select existing material, which is that image that's applied onto the plane. So right now we have that image that this plane has on this object up here, but we're not seeing it show up. And oh, that's my curve. No, that's my mesh. Why is it? Oh, right, it is showing up. So this is that material applied to this infinity sign, but it's looking kind of transparent and we don't see the photo that we're supposed to be seeing. That's because this is where we go into UV editing, where in the UV editor, we go straight into edit mode, and then we select the image here on the left-hand side. And now we're referencing back to what we talked about the object properties. So if I go into my outliner, we said that this right here, which is the UV, is how it controls the image that gets applied to that object. So that's what we'd be seeing. That's what we're seeing here, essentially, is if I go to the top view here and I hit U so that we can unwrap that UV, this is what that UV looks like. This is basically that shape unrolled and how this image is being applied to this object, right? We see it there. So if I start to move this around over here, I see the image move around on the object. Or I can move only certain ones and distort it. What I want to do is hit U again over here and do project from view. So now we have a UV that matches the footprint of the object. And I just got to use again G, S, and Z to get it to fit into my image. And now now we see what that looks like in 3D. And just like with the curve, we can add another modifier. Instead of the subdivision surface, we can add solidify, which will extrude it and give it some thickness. So it's not capped at the top, it's only capped at the bottom, or so it seems like. This is sort of a mistake on part of the import as planes situation. If we go over on the material properties and we scroll down, we come up with the alpha section. So this basically over here on the material properties, we talked over here about selecting a material. And then under surface, right, we have a bunch of settings here, properties for the material. Under surface, this is the actual material that we're looking at. So we see we have a base color is set to an image. You can scroll down, we see we have metallic, we have roughness, we have all this stuff, and it creates an alpha channel, which it really shouldn't be. So I'm going to right click on that or click on it and scroll up here into all my possible texture maps is what these are called. And I'll just remove that alpha. Oops, not remove, disconnect. There we go. So if that doesn't quite fix it, it's just a bit of the property of the object. We don't need to worry about that too much because in rendered view, it typically comes out fine. We could also hit Tab A to select all these. Go to Mesh, Normals, and then hit Flip if that makes it read properly. But for all intents and purposes, this is going to work for us. The final part to this is the Photoshop piece. So that'll be fairly quickly. We just go to Photoshop. We go to a square format and we just make it like 3000 pixels by 3000 pixels. And we can drop in our image. Before I get into this Photoshop piece, any questions on the material? Any questions on giving this thickness or on the UV editing? Any part of that I should recap again?
You're good.
Okay. So I'll drop this in here and scale it up to the full size. Okay. Now what we want to do to this is a few things. We're going to go to adjustments in Photoshop and we're going to go, actually before adjustments, we're going to go to edit, image, not edit. We're going to go into image, adjustments, black and white. And there's only two colors I'm really concerned with here, which is the original sort of bluish color, bluish greenish color, and we have our yellow color. So we only have those two colors to really filter out. So in Photoshop, I'm going to make one layer, duplicate layer of this one that has the greens and one that has the yellows. So on this one here, I'll go to image, adjustments, black and white, make my yellows all the way bright and make everything else really, really dark. And then we hit OK. On the other one, I'm going to do the opposite. We're going to go image, adjustments, black and white, make everything super dark and make the blue and the green super bright. Okay. So with that, we basically silhouetted out a little bit of those different color regions, those different surfaces. We can do that even more by going to adjustments, curves, and then making this pretty much like a straight vertical line and changing their position so that we filter out certain objects that we want. So that shape that we want to get out of this. So that's pretty good. I'm going to keep that one there. Right click to do a clipping mask. So it only affects this layer here. And then I'm going to turn on the bottom one So we do above this one, another adjustments layer for curves and do the same thing. Kind of cut out what it is that we want. We want to get rid of all that sort of faded elements. There we go. Okay. And with this, we go to our channels. And in the channels window, here we would see every color, the blue in the image, the green in the image, the red. If I turn this off and we see this, we see the different channels here. But with the black and white, it doesn't matter which one. You can hit Control click on any one of these and give that a second. And you can see here, it created a selection of all the white regions. So after having all that white selected, we can go to our paths in Photoshop, the paths window. And if you don't have any of these windows, you can always enable them here, window paths or window channels. And this icon right here will make a new path from selection. So we select that. And now what we have is basically the pen tool run over all these details to create a shape. So to kind of see how that was working out, we can now go to layer, new fill layer, solid color. Doesn't matter what color we pick. You can choose red. And basically what we have now is a whole bunch of shape, right? This isn't like image. They're actual shapes that we can now bring into Blender. We'll do that for the other layer. So we'll hide out that shape, hide out that layer, bring up that other layer right here. To recap the process, we go to channels, Control click on any one of these. It creates the selection. We go to paths, new path, and then layer, new fill layer, solid color, and we can make this one purple. Cool. And then we see both of our shapes here together. So that's the, oh, where's the other one? Release clipping mask. I don't know why my shape layer got lost in there. So there we have the purple and the red that we filtered out from that image. If we now, let's see, if we now go to File, Export, Export As, we do the SVG format. If you don't have that, you got to go to Edit, Preferences, Export, and under Export, turn on Use Legacy Export As, and hit OK. We can do File, Export, Export As SVG. And we save that where we have all of our files. And when we bring an SVG into Blender, once it finishes saving, we go to File, Import. And there's two ways to import an SVG. There's SVG as grease pencil, and then there's scalable vector graphics. And that's the one that we want. We select our outline, and there it is. We have our outlines out of Photoshop as actual editable geometry here in Blender. If we go to the top view, I can just use G and S to line this up. You see how this origin point for this one is on the bottom left? We want it in the center so that when we scale, it scales from the center. So we go to Object, Set Origin, Origin to center of mass, or if for the surface or for the volume. We can also do that with the context menu. Set origin, origin to center of volume. So we just get this to line up. Okay. a little bit larger. Pretty good. And if we look at it here, it came in as curves, right? So if we move these up, they just look pitch black. If I hit tab A, you might have some of these weird lines going through, but it's not necessarily getting in the way right here. There is no actual way to go here and do a project view from the top. So what we want to do is similar to before, we duplicate this. We hide, we right click and do convert to mesh, hide the curves. Now we can go to top view, hit tab A to select everything, U to project from view. And so here again, we have the whole shape. Make this match as well. And then we want to assign that material over here, material properties, to that material. And if I hide everything now, except for that one, right, we see that image is now put onto this Photoshop created SVG file. So what's useful about this is it being 3D. If I go to render view, and here I have my render properties, I'm going to go back to layout. If I go to my render properties over here on the right, I can turn on ambient occlusion and bloom to add a little bit of effect to this render. If I go to the material over here for the object, I can duplicate the original by hitting this new material icon here. This basically says this material is being used by 3 objects, and I can hit a new copy here. So now this one's a copy of the original one, but only being used by this object. And if I go down, I can set the emission, which is a color. I can set emission to an image texture. Select this here and also select that image. That's also being used for the color right here. Basically, we have set up a color or light to come off of this object. We can bring up the emission strength. And what we're getting from this glow is this bloom effect. If I bring everything back and hide my base plane, right, we start to see we're having these different elements that if we look from the top, we can start animating. So if I wanted these to rotate, for example, I go to my properties here for the object, and I have the transform properties. By clicking on these objects over here, or these little icons, I'm setting keyframes. So what keyframes are is on the timeline, right? These are all basically each frame, each image that we can generate. And when I hit create keyframe, we set a new point there for its location, for its rotation, and for its scale. So if I move forward a bunch of keyframes and I rotate on the z-axis, let's say to 90, it turns orange, which means I haven't set a keyframe here for what's going on. And I can just hit click here, and now there is a keyframe placed there, and it'll blend between one value and the other. If I hit play, it rotates that image over the other one. So I know it's quite a lot of information, especially if you're new to this 3D software. But essentially what I wanted to get across from this workshop is how we can start generating these concepts. And once the concept is generated and refined, we can manipulate it in 3D to create these different effects. Maybe I should have done another pause there, but is there any one section that you want me to go over again, or any questions